Welcome to Cypher After Hours. I'm Brett Stewart, here with my co-hosts, Emily and David. And in this episode, we're going to continue our discussion on the UFO crash in Brazil that occurred in the 1990s. If you'd like to be part of our discussion, you can find us over on Twitter at Cypher Podcast. It's where Emily, David, and myself will be to interact with you guys under each of the posts for these episodes. So definitely check that out. But in this After Hours show, David got some data, some pretty interesting data on the recovery efforts of the crashed vehicle, of the occupants, and what this technology was planned to be used for. And it ties directly into the idea of Project Bluebeam, which David's going to go into, which has to do with fake alien invasions. So that'll be an interesting one. I'm going to go into some of my data that explored the origin of these life forms, for lack of a better word. They weren't exactly like you or myself. There's something very artificial about them, but I kind of traced them back to their origin. What's it like in the day in the life? Where do they come from? And also a little bit about what their goals are here and why that craft was here in the first place. I alluded to that in the main show, and I'm going to share that data with you here in After Hours. But before we jump into that remote viewing data and some of our personal thoughts about the event, Emily, you mentioned before we started recording today that you have a little bit of a hot take, perhaps, on UFO, UAP phenomenon. So why don't you start us off here before we jump into the rest of our remote viewing data?
Thanks, Brett. I hope the audience can indulge me here in a little bit of a rant. Something that you might have noticed is we use the term UFO, and it's very popular and trendy these days to use the term UAP. And I just wanted to clear the air on what my thoughts are on this and why I'm using UFO. It's actually very intentional. So UFO, for those of you who don't know, it stands for Unidentified Flying Object. And UAP, which is the more modern term, is Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon. And I want to be clear what I think these two terms mean and why we use UFO specifically in the case of, for example, the Virginia UFO incident. UAP is a broad term, which is basically anything we see in the sky or in the air that is unidentified. This could include a strange cloud formation. It could include strange lightning and atmospheric phenomenon, even paranormal atmospheric phenomenon. What I see as a subset of unidentified aerial phenomenon is the UFO, and flying implies, to me at least, a physical object or something that is actually there of unknown origin or unidentifiable properties. So it's not a known aircraft. That would be under the category of identifiable aerial phenomenon or identifiable flying phenomenon. But this is something we can't know, but it seems to exhibit physical properties. So it's different from an atmospheric thing. And that's something that we are interested in looking at on this show. We are interested in looking at the physical phenomenon in cases where we are looking at just a generic aerial paranormal phenomenon. We'll say that. We might even use the term UAP in those contexts, but we're only going to be doing that when we're talking about things that aren't physical. So I don't know how you, Brett or David, feel on this topic. I just thought I'd get this sort of off my chest and let the audience know what I feel about this.
Well, and I could be wrong because I'm not a UFO or ufology expert, but when I think of UAP, where my mind goes is that, well, wasn't that term most likely arrived at so that in the documents that the government was using, that you couldn't FOIA a UFO term, and so they came up with a different term so that people wouldn't find it. And so it was a way of obfuscating that they were investigating these actual physical craft, but they needed to call them something else so that people wouldn't figure it out. How does that play into what you're talking about?
I definitely think there's an element of trying to obfuscate or bury the UFO file. So for those of us who are a little bit older, we always remember this from watching things like the X-Files growing up and so on. We always remember this term UFO. And I think there's intentional language shifting designed to obfuscate what's true. And these things are happening all around us all the time. That's why language is so important to be mindful of when it changes, because it's a shifting of the goalposts and a shifting of the underlying meaning with a specific intention or a specific purpose.
So I can well imagine that this was done as a way to avoid things getting FOIA'd, but I'd like to play devil's advocate and try and put a bit of a positive spin on this as well, and just look at it from another angle, in that phenomena. They're just things that happen that we can experience or we can measure. We can say there's some phenomena, right? And I think recently the UFO, UAP, oh, what do you even call that crowd now? Are they the UFO crowd or the UAP crowd? But people who are interested in this phenomenon are coming around a little bit to the fact that some of this is, for want of a better word, psychic phenomena. This is non-physical or interdimensional. It's deeply related with consciousness. And these are not necessarily just nuts and bolts aircraft. So when you have weird things in the sky, we don't know, and it's becoming more widely acknowledged that it's quite possibly not a physical aircraft that's there. It's not necessarily an object, and it's not necessarily flying. It's a phenomenon, and it's up there. So I think UAP, for me at least, is a better term when you don't know that it really is a physical thing. Obviously, with this Virginia case, yeah, I did it. With the Virginia case, we can say, because we saw it crash, yeah, it was an object and it was flying. But if you're just seeing strange lights and weird things going on in the sky, you can't say that. So I quite like the new term, even if it does have evil origins in stopping people foyering and finding out the truth.
I think it's more than just foying and finding out the truth. I think it's actually a misdirection, because there are physical craft that do occur. And I think this is sort of like a little escape hatch. It's like, oh, you just saw a thing, a weird psychological problem that your brain has. It's mass hallucination. Everyone's basically just seeing things that aren't actually there. I think it's designed to give this convenient escape hatch from saying, no, there's literally physical things in the air that do actually sometimes crash, that we recover and we find. And it's this intentional distancing from this. And so I see it as a much more nefarious thing, even though I agree that it might accurately describe things that we can or can't know. But in this case, I think it's more of a detriment to the community than a positive.
So I think I agree with both of you a little bit in between, because I understand exactly what you're saying, Emily, is that by creating a new term, it's a way for those attempting to control a narrative to separate themselves from the last 100 plus years of UFO evidence that has occurred, written about in newspapers, eyewitness accounts. That is the word, that is the term that has been used since up until recently. Does that mean that all of those were physical phenomena? No, it doesn't. But just because it's an unidentified flying object doesn't mean it's an unidentified physical flying object. That'd be a UPFO. So UFO still fits a UAP. It's the same thing. It's just, what are people making the associations with? And I think there is very likely an agenda to change the term, to disassociate it with all the past evidence that exists out there. There is an agenda to potentially change the term so it couldn't be FOIA'd or found out, so to keep it secretive as well. And I don't know, it's using words to obfuscate reality is kind of what it is, when all of it's still UFO. Even the non-physical stuff that you're talking about, David, is still a UFO. But is it UFO once you finally figure out what it is? Well, then it's not unidentified anymore. So I don't know. I kind of I see both sides. I don't think that this is a semantics thing. This isn't purely semantics, because there are agendas, I think, behind this, and it is worth acknowledging. Which one do I land with? Which one do I take away? I think UFO is better, personally. I think UAP is just kind of going down the rabbit hole of the system of control that wants you to fit inside their box, as opposed to what's already existed since before they've been forced, and it seems like forced, to actually begin to address this.
I know that people have this semantic debate, and I want to be very clear that is not lost on me. I enjoy semantics and definitions. As the audience knows, I like to define terms. The thing that I think is occurring here is actually an intentional psyop shift in language. And the reason I think this is because I haven't heard the conversation that we're having here in most UFO UAP venues. Everyone just made this shift, and they were like, oh yeah, semantics, let's just change the words, no big deal, without even having the discussion of why we're doing it and what those semantics might be, and also the PSYOP historical implications. So the fact that there's an absence of having this particular discussion, to me, is the weird part, and speaks to something that is more than just semantics, right? It's the meta of, why aren't we talking about the fact that the language changed? And so if you have that discussion, now we can go into the semantics and so on. It's okay that it's shifting, but let's be very clear as to why and what might be the minuses as well as the pluses of doing this.
I can certainly name one of the minuses, which is now you have to use 2 hashtags on Twitter instead of 1. Everybody's hashtag UFO Twitter, hashtag UAP Twitter. So they overlap anyway. It's like now we have redundant terms. Nobody's let go of UFO, but now we have to call them UAPs as well.
The term UFO is more disparaged, I think, than UAP. UAP is the more sophisticated. You know what you're talking about. Oh, this is military intelligence. So therefore it has credence associated with it. UFOs, well, you're a UFO crackpot. If you're a UAP, you're a UAP investigator. And so it's a way of actually dividing a community in half. And well, what do you do after you divide? Well, you can control and conquer it. I don't see any practical value in UAP. I really don't. I think you can split hairs, I suppose, on is light an object or not an object. I don't think that matters. I think it's causing more confusion than it's actually adding benefit to the discussion. Saying they're all UFOs, I think is fine. And there was no harm in that. And this taken from here, we're not even talking about the experience phenomenon of when people see things in the sky that aren't even there, which is another, are those UFOs? Are those, they're not UAPs, and they're probably not UFOs either. No, because it's not aerial. No, it's not happening. No, it's not happening in the sky. It's happening in your mind. It's not in the sky. So therefore it's not either. So there's a whole other nuance to this that's also not being injected into the discussion. But I do think this is a valuable one to have so that we can kind of have our bearings whenever new information kind of comes our way and how to assess it and address it.
Yeah, I can get behind that. I find the idea that it's a psyop very plausible from my own rootling around in these topics. You look at enough conspiracy theories, eventually you start to be able to smell the ones that are deliberate obfuscations and fakes. And somebody is creating those and has been for some time, and they must have an agenda, right? The things we look at here, I find this idea extremely plausible in comparison to some of the stuff that we do, unfeedbackable things and experiences that we have. Those are the things you can say, I really don't know. Is there government psyops to control narratives about things? Yes, we know there is. It's in the public domain. Why shouldn't this be one of them?
Well, what is one of those potential government psyops, David? Because I think your remote viewing data, when you looked at the agency responsible for the collection of the material at the crash site that we just remote viewed, you went down that rabbit hole and you looked at their motivations, what they wanted to do in the future and what that all looked like. So why don't you take us away and share that story with us and the listeners?
Okay, so one of the most interesting things known by people involved that is not public knowledge is that there is a design plan or blueprint for a machine. It's just their idea. They're not sure if it's real, if it's going to work, but they're keeping it to themselves. This is a secret thing. And what is that? It's a mechanism for journeying a long way away, which is just exactly this reverse engineering UFO tech and secret space programs kind of trope, isn't it? So there is a quiet, specific, small thing which is harnessing this big, chaotic, loud energy. It's a moonshot project. I'm not sure they even expect it to work themselves, which, again, kind of tallies with a lot of the stories you hear that scientists investigate this stuff and they just get stuck because it's so far ahead. So I asked, are there any more secrets? And I got this very tantalizing answer. Yes, the people who are doing this are being misled. They're led up the garden path. They have no idea what they're doing. And amusingly here, I had an AOL of the military remote viewing program, which what we do is descended from. And we have reason to believe there was a reasonable amount of deception and dishonesty by omission, shall we say, going on in the development of that technology. They want something, a prize, but this is a motivator which has been provided to them by others. They're being manipulated, or the organization they represent is. It's all cut and dried to them, AOL of the military. To us in the know, it's way more mysterious and unknown. And one of them is complaining, but they wouldn't help if we didn't sell the project with fake concrete ideas, deliverables, and budgets and stuff. It's like there's the people who are selling this are saying, oh, yes, we'll get the aircraft and we'll reverse engineer it and it will be good. And you can see there's like a return on investment from this project. And it's a sensible military R&D project. And we're going to, but really they know, or somebody knows that this gets much weirder. So earlier on, I had that there was some people there doing data collection. They were observing, I think one of the craft, probably the one that was shot down. They were waiting. I saw this guy, he's checking his wristwatch. He had a logbook. I saw the logbook in front of him, time, date. Did you see the thing? Did you not see the thing? They're kind of gathering this data for a long-term project, which it appears includes recovery of the material from the Virginia incident. So what are they doing? We're biding our time. When the time is right, we will take sudden action. It's secret, it's clandestine. It made me think of the government. It's got to be the government or something government sanctioned or funded, right? So there's a small group of people with a singular mission. They are the ones who have the saucer. They want to kickstart something to change the paradigm, an undercurrent, preserving something into the future. Like, I think the continuity of their own group. Maybe this is even a multi-generational kind of project where it's going to span more than one person's career. This is such a big, long-term idea. They're hiding it away in private. They benefit from it, and they call it our little secret. The structure or object they have, it looks like an analog stopwatch. And I saw in Brett's work, he had a sketch of this exact same thing. It's a saucer. Radial, circle, markings, AOL, UFO, there's a surprise. So it's hollow, it's rotating, it's got this weird higher dimensional curving in over on itself thing. Aerodynamic. They're squeezing the information about it. They're squeezing the information out of it, as we briefly touched on in the show before. So what is this future op that they're preparing for? And this is where it gets totally nuts. Because I'd heard about Project Bluebeam and the idea of a fake alien invasion, but I've really kind of experienced what the intention is for that here. And it was only when I'd finished the session, I looked through it and was like, shit, this is Bluebeam or something very like it. So I was retasked by Emily on like, go to this future op and look at it from the perspective of the people who it's being done to, right? The people who are having the op carried out on them. And immediately I got this feeling of like urgent, must get away, kind of like somebody's running out the door so fast. And then me as the remote viewer turns up and goes, hello, do you mind if I ask you a few questions about your experience of this operation? And they're running out the front door and they're like, no, I really have no time to talk about this. They're confused. Their general vibe is, I don't know what the hell's going on. So I said, right, let's kind of construct a generic experiencer of this, an imaginary person who's experiencing it in a representative way. And we'll do an interview with them. So after that, I moved to the general group of people who'd been subject to this op just to look at the primary effect on them. This is pretty chilling stuff. I said they're pushed and pulled hither and thither like a herd of sheep controlled by a dog. They're lost, scared, confused, and easily controlled. They're all looking in different directions. So I interviewed this generic person experiencing the op. I asked them what they're experiencing. They said there's a sudden loud noise like a plane overhead. There's bright lights. They thought that they were at war or under attack. They felt like curling up in a ball and hiding, overwhelmed. They're also experiencing, after the noise and light, there's no information about it at all. They're confused. They don't know what to think. Their best guess as to what happened is that there was something in the sky, but they're so upset and confused at this point that they can't really make any sense of it. Biggest effect moving forward in time, like the biggest outcome, the biggest effect on them is that they just feel lost and ungrounded. They don't know what to think. It's like they're in a fugue state, like psychological warfare or how people felt after 9/11. How their behavior changes is they actually carry on as normal, but they feel like they're in a dream all the time. Like reality isn't quite real anymore. What did they perceive during the main event? They perceived on the horizon distant flashing lights, moving motions, smoke, distant sounds like gunfire. It was a very dynamic, smoky thing, and it looked just like an aerial battle. And that's what they felt it was as well. It was very threatening and really gave the impression that we're at war, but nobody told me. This is what was fundamentally so upsetting about the experience, is that there was no information provided. They're experiencing this terrifying spectacle, and they're completely in the dark.
So before you go on to the rest of your data here, as you're reading this, it's funny, I didn't actually go into your work for this part. I was just waiting for this after hours to hear what you got in relationship to it. And as you read it, it actually strikes a certain chord with me. And I don't know why it strikes this chord, well, other than a specific event, which I'm going to point to, but I don't have the answer for why I experienced that event. But in 2014, I would say for a period of about 3 to 4 months, I had a reoccurring dream of what you just described 3 to 4 times a week for about 12 plus weeks in a row. And where I was just somewhere outside, it was in the evening, and in the sky were a tremendous amount of what looked like non-human crafts, thousands of them everywhere, fighting each other in the sky. And everyone was panicking and freaking out. Things were doing flybys along the ground and then going back up into the sky. And then it was just over and no one knew what the hell happened. So it's just a dream. And this happened, geez, almost like 8 years ago now, but almost 10 years ago now, I guess. But it's pretty fascinating hearing you. And this isn't exactly a brand new idea either. This has been out in the human consciousness too. But it's interesting hearing you read that because it's bringing me right back to 2014 when I had this unannounced and unexplained sequence of repeating dreams over and over again.
Yeah, this was quite hard hitting for me in the session as well. This is kind of like I'm having flashbacks reading this out because it was chilling.
So the thing that I'm mindful of is that this is going back 27 years looking at a future op. It's potentially a rollout of a future possibility that may have yet to occur, but that may have already been sort of decided that it won't occur. In other words, maybe there was a timeline where this happened in the past, and maybe there's been a pivot away from this, or maybe it's still to come. But I think that's something that the audience should bear in mind is we're not saying that we think necessarily this is in our future. It may have been a projection of what a possible future was going back 27 years.
Well, this wasn't even looking at the real event, I don't think. This was the intent of the people who were taking the technology to reverse engineer it. This is what they wanted to do with it. And I'll get into why in a moment. But we don't know that they would have succeeded in reverse engineering the technology necessary or that they would have carried out the plan. This was just their cool idea.
And this has a really interesting tie-in back to the thing that, Brett, you had in your session with craft malfunctioning and projecting these holograms. It's almost like maybe they were aware of the fact that the craft could do this. And part of the reverse engineering was, okay, we need to figure out how the craft is generating these holographic projections because maybe we can use that cool technology. And maybe they have succeeded or maybe they failed. We don't know. But it's certainly very interesting as it relates to the data you got in your original session, Brett.
The puzzle piece fits. If they took that technology and were able to reverse engineer it, that's exactly what I described that tech that was malfunctioning on the down craft was doing, is it was creating holographic things in the environment around it, but it was broken. So it was like creating them erratically. There's no puppeteer behind the puppet. So they kind of just were there and then they weren't there. And hey, what a powerful technology. If you could use that to project something up into the sky that looked real, that could even come all the way down to the deck and fly over people's heads. And it wasn't actually real, just appeared real to all of our human senses. Man, that's a powerful tool. And yeah, you're right. That's what I perceived existed on board the craft that crashed.
We also see this particular narrative play out in a lot of Hollywood movies over the last 2 decades. So there's a lot of Hollywood movie themes. We have classic Independence Day and a whole bunch of these things, predictive programming, where it's just, even if it doesn't actually occur, the fact that they're trying to, through Hollywood films, inject this into the kind of collective consciousness of society. It's almost like this hedging their bets. In case we want to do this op in the future, let's prime the public to have this particular imagination such that we can exploit that imagination or that captivating of minds sometime in the future. There has been infiltration of Hollywood and mainstream media by deep state interests. Not that everything that's out there is going to be directly influenced by this, but there are very clear ties of certain films that have been produced with the help of government funding, right? And they don't just fund things for fun. They fund things because they deliver a particular message.
If you look at the list of movies that have been funded by, I think, just the US Army, so forgetting all the other interference, just to portray the military narrative in a positive light. And it's like movies you would never expect. It's so many movies, and the advisors, and there's all this extra funding. They've actually had a really profound effect on movies just for this one propaganda piece, which I think is really subtle in many cases, because it's things like kids' films and films that don't even involve really the military. There's still this kind of foreign policy, military propaganda line going in there. So what else is going on?
This flows also into video games. So that's another aspect, is they fund video game development to convey a particular mindset or narrative. So I don't think we can completely disentangle the sort of creative inspiration downloads from the intentional psyops. I think there's both of these things are going on, and it's something we should always keep an eye out for and always ask ourselves, what do we think this is? Because I don't think it's one or the other.
So whenever I hear these New World Order, global takeover, conspiracy theory things, it's an interesting question to ponder. just, if these people exist, what the hell is wrong with them? Like, how messed up do you have to be to think that this is what you should do in your life? It's an interesting question, right? And this data sheds some light on that, and I found this really interesting because I've never known the answer to that question. So I look at what is the end result that's achieved by this op. Like, what's the point? And I say a space has been opened up, like metaphorically speaking. It's a sphere of influence. The space as thoughtful or information or reasoning, it's like they've kind of expanded people's minds in a controlled direction. This directed action is like force or will or intent. They're using this kind of artificially expanded or created worldview, which is kind of a bit like a religion or a religious cult in a way. They're using it to impose their will on people. The opening establishes a foothold from which they can do this. And then I'm like, well, okay, sure, but this is very complicated, expensive, convoluted thing to do. Like, why bother, right? What is motivating them? And I've said the motivation is sideways, oblique, odd perspective, really unusual worldview leads to seemingly nonsensical action. And then it kind of comes to me and I go, there's a weird belief that they believe something totally weird and unusual. And that's why they're motivated to do these apparently completely nutty and evil things. So the last thing I look at here is to go look at what is the weird belief. And I initially get a visual, which I guess is a metaphor of like a weak and malformed, gibbering life form, like that scene in one of the Aliens movies where there's all like the mutant hybrids they find on the spaceship. And then Sigourney Weaver gets the flamethrower and melts all of it. Yeah, it's kind of a form like that, a hideously deformed, weak, terrible kind of creature. And I AOL that this is their view of humanity. This is how they're looking at humanity, as this weak, terrible thing. So they have a divergent worldview. At some point in the past, their worldview, their stories that they live by, has diverged from everybody else. And there's a particular topic, I don't know what it is, but most people, you and I, probably think whatever this is just like no big deal. It's not a big issue. And this group of people has become convinced that this is like terrible, and they must make it their mission to fix this thing, right? It's like scapegoating almost. They find some problem and blame all the world's ills on it, and now it's their like almost God-given mission to fix this. And if fixing it involves doing these kinds of things, presumably they'd lead on to some kind of totalitarian government. I dread to think what it is that they feel needs fixing, but I don't think I would agree with them. So from this point of divergence on, they're just on a mission. These people are on a wild goose chase, and then I'd had quite enough of that. So that is the motivation underpinning people trying to get hollow projectors from crashed aircraft in order to do Project Bluebeam, according to my data.
So, David, what you've described there sounds like the classic breakaway society narrative or archetype or meme. I don't know what the correct term there is, but it's the classic sort of breakaway society thing where there's this group of people that's hidden away from all of us. It seems like whenever you try to control everything, the more things are going to break down. And ultimately, these things all collapse under their own weight.
Yeah, large hierarchical systems don't scale. They don't scale up. They become inefficient and they ossify and they collapse. Right? This is why people do startups to create technology innovations. They don't generally go to huge, massive, lumbering corporations with all their communication overhead. You lose your ability to maneuver when you get big, and then things move on and you can't adapt.
I think my mind goes to the speculation whether or not this entire plan was attempted but failed before it actually got off the ground. And I can't know this. I haven't remote viewed it. It's where my mind goes and where my gut goes is, could the reason be why back almost 10 years ago, I was having all those dreams because that was the plan, but then something occurred that stopped it.
So Brett, if you had the dream about that, maybe it was actually done somewhere. Like they do the nuclear tests out in the ocean where nobody's going to see it. Perhaps they did it somewhere where there's nobody to witness it. There's just like a bunch of military secret guys on a boat in the middle of the Pacific where there's nobody there. And they like test it out. And then they go, this is too evil. You're being shut down. You can't do this. Go home. Think about your life choices.
Yeah, maybe. It was really weird. It was definitely weird, but I've had a number of weird experiences in my life, and that would probably be one of them. Speaking of the weird, and speaking of this topic of the UFO crash, there's no shortage of additional data that goes off into the woo and the strange, because my work took a slightly different turn. As opposed to looking at the ramifications and the agencies and the agendas on the human side, I went down the rabbit hole of the non-terrestrial side. Who were these beings? And I really wish, to be honest, I mean, we can always come back, but I wish I had gotten a bit more, because I got a lot of interesting information, but I didn't get quite as much about the intentions, but I did get some. So I'd like to just go over some of that data now, and then we can talk about it and then wrap up this after hours show, just giving our own personal thoughts.
I just want to clarify for our audience. So there was a divergence between David and Brett, because we looked at, both of them got this covert op that was associated with the target. All of us think that after looking at the data, that where Brett went with his data was actually the op that the crashed ship was engaged in. And the data that David got was the op that was associated with the crash cover-up or the crash cleanup. And so that sort of hopefully helps frame this discussion a little bit.
It's almost a division of labor, but it is kind of funny that there were two different ops going on here. One op with the other op, and both were secretive. Both are, don't let anyone know about what's really going on. But yeah, because what I was directed to by you, Emily, was to take a look at the occupant or occupants inside the craft at the time right before the crash, and then kind of follow that back. And the thing that I locked onto for the occupant to begin with was the one that seemed to be in the driver's seat. And the one in the driver's seat was deceased before the actual surface-to-air missile collided with the craft. In fact, it seemed like they had been deceased for quite some time. And my impression was that this vehicle, that it was in orbit on a mission with a purpose, and something happened that the operator of that vehicle died. Now, there seemed to have been two other occupants, at least, that I picked up on, and those were the two gray alien-looking folks that I drew in the session that were captured alive by ground forces. At least that's allegedly what happened. But the driver, or the big man in charge, so to speak, seems to have perished for whatever reason, because it seemed like a long time ago, which is also kind of strange. But it's not so strange when you put the life forms that were captured into the proper context. When I looked at the actual creatures with the big eyes that looked like the gray aliens, maybe slightly different, and I followed them back to where they came from. And so I used a movement command to go back to the point when the occupant who was flying or operating that craft was alive. And what I got was rather strange, because the information came in first and then the visuals came in second. The information that came in first is that I'm describing something that's made out of silicone. This is a life form that is artificial. It's artificial in nature. It's a simulated life form. And that the body that was sitting in the driver's seat of this craft was like an avatar or a host that acted as a carrier for some other type of intelligence. But it was an artificial body, kind of. So it's like there were probably some organic elements to it, but it's like it's not all organic. And so again, this reminded me, I've heard certain stories about this in the past. I mean, go back to some of our Bigfoot stories. Funny enough, go listen to that show, because there's interesting avatars at play even in those. I'm not sure those are artificial in nature. Those I think are more biological, but this was an artificial-esque type of life form that was a host for some other type of intelligence. And when I went back to a point in time when it was alive, I described that this thing, it was sitting in this chair. It was a really cozy interior to this craft, by the way. This chair had a red felt covering the seat. It had a little table in front of it with this really interesting animated book, is kind of the way I perceived it, that was in front of it, that had pages that kind of moved and oscillated on their own, that I think that was probably the control panel for where the seat was. But it was really cozy. It had these really nice wooden panels along the inside of the craft. I mean, it was, I wouldn't mind renting one of these for the weekend. But anyway, the purpose of what it was doing, I got a general sense that this was a scout ship. It was on a mission. It was hunting for something specific. And it was like a bearer for a message of some larger entity or group. It's like when a messenger in the olden days with kings and queens in the medieval era, and a messenger would arrive before the entourage of the king showed up. That's kind of like what this was, is it was supposed to show up first to scout, to be a messenger, to understand exactly what's here, but also to be a bearer of news for what's coming. And what's coming is a much larger force or organization that it is kind of just this forward messenger for. And it's funny because when I looked at it at the end of that data point, I got, they're coming. So it's like, well, who is they and why are they coming? And unfortunately, I didn't get really the why are they coming, but I did get who is the they. And I had a movement where I looked at the origin of the occupant during its life before it was here around Earth. What was that like? And I went to the moment of its inception. Like, where was it? What did it look like? What was going on? And the very first thing I saw, it was a very long pole in this misty cloud environment with many pods, like spherical pods, like grapes on a vine, going off as far as in the distance as I could see. And in each one of these spherical pods was one of these life forms, these artificial life forms. And at this point, I was like, oh, these are embryonic sacs that seem to grow robots. And so they aren't straight up machines, but they're like machines because they're like a mixture of the two. And this is like this is like a farm that grows these things. And then when the body of the life form is finished growing, it's like this device came along, plucked it off the branch, put it down on a surface, punctured the exterior of the shell, and then it's like all this fluid and all this stuff kind of came out of it, and then up stood this creature without really a mind of its own. It was kind of just like an automaton. It stood up, walked over to another structure like it was getting in line, ready to have its intelligence flashed onto its hard drive or its mind. And there was a lot of these things. It seemed almost like a growing / production facility for these beings. And once they got to inside the structure, it's almost like ticket please, and the next one went through in the line, and then it was hooked up or put in front of some device, and then it was like flashed with awareness or a purpose. And I think that some other consciousness or awareness kind of went down or became a part of this thing that then says, oh, now that's what my task is. I'm going to go over in that ship. I'm going to go out there in space somewhere, and that's my job. And it just goes and does its job. So it's kind of like these are really advanced drones, very sophisticated robots that have an element or degree of life and consciousness to them. But they aren't, again, this just goes back to what I said in the main show. It's life, but not as we know it. This seems to be kind of like worker bees that are being sent out for a purpose, as opposed to like another form of human life from somewhere out in the universe. I think it's real intelligence. And this is something that I noticed at the crash site right before, actually it was right before the vehicle came down, is I perceived the deceased body of the thing, but there in the same cabin, so to speak, I noticed that there was something else there that was non-physical, like a spirit. I described it almost like there's a poltergeist type of energetic phenomenon that had awareness that was also there in the cabin that had come from the dead being. So it was like if something passed away, that the consciousness was actually still there on board for some reason, like it hadn't left. And I think that could very well be the thing that at the inception of this thing was fused with it after it had been plucked from its growing facility and then infused with awareness of something a little bit bigger than itself. So I don't know exactly how that would work, obviously. And these are very science fiction-y, woo out there, space alien type stuff. So take it all, please, with a grain of salt. But it was a very interesting, vivid ERV journey I had. Even where this location of growing these life forms existed in was really fantastical. It's pretty wild. It almost felt like I was in a gas cloud because there were all these really vibrant pink and purple colors and hues in the space around it. There was no distinguishable ground features, like, oh, there's a mountain, and there's a building on the ground. I was on like this metal platform, and there were these big rings orbiting around it, but then everything else was just like a fog or a mist of purples and pinks. And then attached to these gray, kind of almost industrial poles were all these huge spheres of these life forms. There was thousands of them going off in one direction. almost like you'd see in the Matrix movie when they put human bodies in those containers. So it was pretty wild looking.
Yeah, your description totally reminded me of that scene in The Matrix, all the lightning zapping up the thing. I'm just wondering, do you know who is responsible for the great people? Who is growing all these beings?
I don't. And so this is the one thing I wish I had done a little bit more research on. I was going to do it. Unfortunately, they got to my cat, my feline, and they told my feline to come jump on my lap and wake me up from the ERV session because I was too deep. I was uncovering their mysteries and their secrets. So my cute little kitty came along and needed some love. So I unfortunately don't have the answer for this time around on who exactly they were, other than this being was a messenger for them, an advanced scout, and also kind of a bell toll, like an advance warning that they are coming, whoever they are. And so it was a sense that they're coming to Earth for whatever reason.
This is why your cat needs its own tinfoil hat.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Brett, I think you actually use the term harbinger in your session. So it's a harbinger of something. Even though it's really cool to hear these sci-fi stories, I know none of them are feedbackable. I think it's still kind of fun to speculate what they might be, or to at least entertain them, keep our mind open. But it is important to know that we're totally speculating. We have no idea if any of this stuff is accurate or not, but it's fun to think about.
So I think my big takeaway, if I were to sum up what I think is going on here and what's my opinion about the events that occurred in Brazil, 1996, January 20th, on a Saturday evening, I think that we're dealing with a bona fide extraterrestrial craft that was in orbit of Earth. Something happened to the pilot and the craft was coming down. I don't think it was coming down quickly. I think that some sort of auto system was okay. It's like I was getting the impression like it ran out of gas finally, and that it's going to go put itself down. And military operations saw this thing. They were tracking this thing, and they also probably wanted to recover pieces from it. And so what occurred is they shot it down. There were occupants on board, but the driver was not in control. Maybe these were spare bodies or something that it just was never able to get working for it. I don't know, these other creatures that they found meandering around and eventually captured. I do think it was shot down. There was a very clear surface-to-air missile that collided with the craft. There was a wreck site that military showed up and they cleaned up. That was very evident in the remote viewing data. And then some very secretive group from the U.S. stormed in, took everything, threatened everyone, tried to pay everyone off. This was part of the documentary, which is really fascinating. They said, I need your children. This was the three girls who saw the alien up against the fence. Someone, according to their mother, came in with a huge briefcase of money and said, I need you to convince your children to say it was all made up. I'll make you rich. And the mother said, how dare you? And she yelled at him out of the house. How dare you come at me with like this and the integrity of my children and so on. I think there was a second UFO that showed up a week later. That was part of a reconnaissance mission to figure out what happened. And they were just a little bit too late. Whether they moved on and did actually recover the bodies wherever the U.S. reconnaissance team collected, we don't know.
So it's important to remember that we should never treat remote viewing data as actionable unless it's confirmed by another means of data collection. But that said, combining the witness testimonies with our apparently extremely consistent, unbelievable remote viewing data, they're both telling the same story. I haven't got anything nuts or implausible or that doesn't fit. It just seems like this is as close to cut and dry, it was aliens, as we're ever going to be able to get, which still has its important caveats, but it's as good as it gets. It was aliens. And I am saying it's aliens. I'm doing the hands and everything.
David, this is one for the history books.
Yeah, because usually I'm like, well, it could have been this, it could have been that. It's not necessarily aliens. But this time I'm having to say, if it's not aliens, I don't know what it is.
So I'm obviously with David and Brett on the side of, yes, this is very much a real event. Physical things occurred. And that was actually part of the tasking, was that give us the true physical reality events that occurred surrounding this incident. And I think we got some very interesting data. When we go into these tasks, we never really know what we're going to get. And the fact that we got some new information as well as confirmation of what we already do know, what's on the record, is pretty fascinating. So overall, I'm very pleased with this particular tasking, and hopefully we can do more like it in the future.
We'll have to figure out who's coming and I don't know, see what's behind that. Door number 3. real alien invasion, not the blue beam alien invasion.
What if the real aliens stopped the fake aliens? Just something that occurred to me. There you go. There's an interesting plot twist. The real aliens like, we're not having any of this fake alien stuff.
There's a twist.
Oh, hey, a great plot twist.
Think about it. They shot down the craft and abducted the aliens, and then we have in our RV data that this second craft is coming along and looking for him. I mean, I'm sure there's a whole story that occurred after that we just didn't look at. So it'd be pretty interesting.
If they ever do show up, though, if like the real aliens ever show up and it's all pew 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 in the sky, I'm just going to be out on my lawn in a deck chair with a beer, like, hey, look, kids, this is a fake alien invasion. Nobody knows it's fake, but let's just chill. And then there's going to be real aliens, and it'll be like, oh my god, I've misjudged the situation terribly.
Well, I think this is a good place to wrap up this After Hours show. Don't forget, just like I mentioned at the beginning, you can have a discussion with us over on Twitter. It's where we're going to start acting with you guys. If you want to reach out to us, you can just head over to our Twitter account at Cypher Podcast. It's PSIPHR Podcast. And in the comments for each episode is where Emily, David, and myself would be happy to have a conversation with you. So if you have any thoughts that you want to share or start a conversation, that's where we'll be. If you really enjoyed this episode, definitely share the free main show with your friends and give us a 5-star thumbs up rating over on Spotify or Apple Podcast. It definitely helps us a lot. But with that, we're going to wrap this up. So thanks for joining us on this epic UFO adventure. Until next time, take care.